if nothing else, when the opposition looked at our stuff, they would think, I wish I had one of them.
You are listening to Service Course by the Cycling Podcast.
I'm thinking, oh my God, that looks really cool. Yeah, I wonder if they found something.
It's strange, it's different. So, to be honest, it's not my favorite bike, but it's something for sure innovative.
Look, let's face it, cyclists like anything that's sexy.
With Lizzy Banks and Tom Whalley.
Well, you join us by a nice crackling fire. Where are we, Lizzy?
We're in the Yorkshire Bridge Inn, just next to Lady Bower Reservoir.
And this has been nice for me because I've been off the bike for a little while. I'm getting rubbish at cycling, and so only about 45 minutes to this place, nice and easy. Thanks, Lizzy. Thanks for being so considerate.
You're welcome. Nice warm fire to keep us warm because it's bloody freezing outside as well.
I'm on probably the opposite end of the form spectrum to you because you are pretty much gearing up to get started racing. So before we get into this month's episode, how are you doing? How's the form? How are the legs?
Oh, yeah, it's great. I was over in Mallorca for 2.5 weeks over Christmas, so I had some really nice sunny training over there while you guys were in the miserable British winter. So yeah, all getting going now after training camp in a couple of weeks, and then the season kicks off. Yeah, really not long now. So hopefully the form's coming good, and well, we'll see in a few months, I guess.
Well, obviously you've been doing this a while, not that long, but a while. You know your body, you know the sensations. Do you judge your form compared to like a previous year or how your winter's gone? Yeah,
sure. I mean, on the bike, yeah, you know how you feel, you know how you felt at this time in a different year, but I think you can always look back at things with rose-tinted glasses, or the opposite, in fact. And I'd say I feel pretty good on the bike right now. I feel stronger than I maybe felt in other years, but it's kind of to be expected because I've not been doing that long. So, the amount of endurance I gained with the extra miles last year compared to the year before, I think I did 100 extra hours last year than the year before. So, still at the moment you're kind of gaining year on year. So, yeah, it's looking good, but we'll see. It's an Olympic year, so it's going to be blimmin' tough.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously this year, the year just gone, you had the Worlds to consider, and then this year it's a different proposition, isn't it, with the Olympics. They come at different times, they're different, goals. So does that change how you winter a little bit?
A little bit, but I think it changes everything for everybody because coming into the spring races, every single person in every single nation is fighting for that spot, and there are so few spots. There's only 67 spots worldwide. So, the whole peloton's going to be flying. So I think it's going to make the races really interesting. So make sure you tune into the women's cycling races this spring.
Well, actually, by the time this episode's gone out and the gap between this and next month's episode, you will have started racing, I guess. So where should our listeners look out for you? Which results do we need to look for?
Yeah, so we start our season in Spain, the Vuelta Valenciana and Setmana Valenciana, which I don't think they're televised, but then straight into Omloop Het Nieuwsblad. So you should be able to catch that live on YouTube, I think. So look out for us there. Bigla Katusha.
And this week's episode, this is the way we kind of do this show. Often we sort of alternate. One of us is working on one episode 1 month, and the other's working on another episode for the next month. Lizzy, tell us about this episode.
Yeah, so this month we're looking at the new Hope track bike that is the Great Britain cycling team's big hope for 2020. They're hoping that that's what's going to make the difference. I think that generally, in the past, GB have been by far and away the dominant force, and other nations are kind of slowly creeping up on them. So yeah, this is the brand new bike, unveiled in October, first ridden at the Minsk Track World Cup, and then then shown again on the boards of the Glasgow Velodrome. So this episode is really just all about that bike. We go and meet the man behind the machine, Tony Purnell, and take a little look at the history of the original Lotus track bike as well.
Well, I think what we should do, actually, before we go anywhere else, most people will have seen the new GB track bike, but for those that haven't, maybe it's a really striking looking machine. Can you describe it, Lizzy?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to describe because it's almost a bit of a spaceship of a bike. I think it's pretty different to the majority of track bikes we see. Most of them, they're really pretty much one and the same. So the main features of this bike are that the forks and seat stays are hugely flared compared to your average bike. They're kind of in the same plane as the leg, so there's a really, really wide gap between the fork and the wheel, and then again at the back, the seat stays come from really high up towards the saddle, and then they flare immediately outwards, and then they flare right down to where they join the rear end of the bike, right by the cassette.
It's almost like a sort of a rectangular frame on the back of the bike, isn't it? It's so. I mean, I've not seen anything designed in that way before at all.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to describe. I mean, the best thing to do is go and Google it. But yeah, to say incredibly wide, very flared forks, more than you would imagine they would actually be able to engineer and keep the bike stiff and stable, and not snap. But apparently they do manage to do that. So, well, I hope so anyway. So British cycling have a pretty long history with Lotus, going back to the 80s, and Tom's going to tell us a little bit about this now.
They are underway then. Lemon here starting in the home straight, and in the back straight is Chris Boardman. They come together for the first time in this series, the two quickest pursuiters throughout. What a final this promises to be.
Any mention of a Lotus track bike, and you can't help but think of the Lotus 108 and be instantly taken back to the glory days of the individual pursuit, when it was a major feature of the track programme at the Olympic Games. The history of the bike is typical of the history of many bikes that look to push the sport forward, in that it was initially banned by the UCI. Originally known as the Lotus Sport Pursuit Bicycle, a catchy title, the bike was renamed the Lotus 108, but was shelved in 1987 because of the UCI's ruling that the bike was illegal. Interestingly, this was because the UCI at that time had a ban on monocoque frames. Essentially, this means that the structure supports its loads and forces through its single skin, and this seems short-sighted as most of us nowadays ride bikes that are constructed this way. Every single carbon bike is made that way. That ban was lifted in 1990, but in those 3 years since 1987, the designer of the bike, Mike Burrows, had lost interest and was indulging his passion for designing recumbent bicycles. At this point, the Lotus 108 could have been lost to history had it not caught the attention of employee Rudy Toman, who took the design to his boss, Roger Becker, who saw it as a real opportunity to diversify into a new market. Remember, at this time in Britain, we're in the midst of a recession, one which badly affected Lotus.
The survey is the gloomiest produced by the London Chamber of Commerce during the current economic crisis. It indicates further deterioration in the capital's economy, with output falling to a new low, accelerating job losses and dwindling investment.
Before taking the innovative new bike to the Olympics in Barcelona in 1992, the UCI rules deemed that the bike had to be used at least once in competition before the Games. Now, you may associate the Lotus 108 with Chris Boardman, but the British Cycling Federation were worried that by allowing Chris to use the bike in competition, it would draw too much attention to the machine. And so the prototype was actually given to Brian Steele, who rode it in a World Cup qualifying event in Leicester. And riding it, he took 5 seconds off his time in the 2-kilometre pursuit. The UCI scrutineer weighed it, measured it, and passed it. It was ready to go to Barcelona. If the British Cycling Federation wanted confirmation that the bike was indeed fast, then that came during a practice session in the Olympic Velodrome when Chris Boardman took 4 seconds off the pursuit world record. And then, a few days later, he went on to claim Britain's first cycling gold medal in 72 years.
And he's going to catch him. 3:21.6 then at the 3-kilometre point. He's got almost 6 seconds lead. Such now is the speed of Boardman, and really,
as always with track cycling, a radical new design leaves all the other federations rushing to catch up, and the advantage eventually diminishes. But that wasn't the end of the story for the Lotus. 2 years later, the bike reappeared in another iteration, this time as the Lotus 110, a road time trial bike which was once again ridden by Chris Boardman, this time in the opening time trial at the 1994 Tour de France. It was 7.2 kilometres, and it started and finished in Lille.
Chris Boardman boring down in now. LeBlanc sees him, moves away. Boardman switches tracks. This is going to be a tremendous ride by Boardman.
Boardman won that TT, and he did so in a record average speed of a Tour de France TT. And remember, this was the 90s, at a time when the peloton was finding all sorts of ways to go very, very fast. Boardman's record stood for 21 years.
Of 7 minutes 49.973 seconds, and surely that is going to take some beating.
The final time that the Lotuses were ridden in competition was 1995. The design of the 110 was banned by the UCI in 1996, one of the reasons why the bike still looks so futuristic, as there's been nothing like it in competition since. Over the span of 5 years, 15 Lotus 108s were built and 263 110s. They're bikes that inspire nostalgia and an intense level of fandom, which is why Tony Wybrodt founded the Lotus 110 Club with the aim of tracking down all 263 of the frames. A couple of them are still ridden in domestic time trials in the UK, and a modified one will feature in this year's Hawaii Ironman, taking place in October.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thanks, as always, to Science in Sport for their continued sponsorship of the Cycling Podcast and all that we do here. If you want to get 25% off your next order with Science in Sport, then simply go to the website and enter the offer code SISCP25. That's SISCP25.
So, where are we now? We've kind of come full circle, and the new track bike, it really does seem to be the first huge step forward we've had in terms of a radical change in design since, I don't know, the original Lotus track bike. So we decided to try and delve a bit deeper into the evolution of this new frame and went to go and see the chief of the Secret Squirrel Club himself, the real driving force and inspiration behind this bike, Tony Purnell. So Tony's career was initially involved in F1, and here's a bit about how he first got involved with the Great Britain cycling team and where the ideas for the bike first came from.
It just coincided with me having taken up bike racing again. As a schoolboy, I was a mad bike racer, to the point that I was in trouble at school the whole time. You can relate to that. You know, it's like an addiction. And I started that again, and someone must have told Chris Boardman that there's this Formula One guy who's bonkers on bike racing. Next thing I know is Chris is saying, would you like to be my successor? They called it the Secret Squirrel Club in those days. And actually, it couldn't have been timed better, because life was getting complicated with lots of jobs that I wasn't really into, and then I thought, yeah, I fancy that. So that's how I'm here, really. So Rio was pretty successful, you know, and I was really very proud of my involvement. It felt just terrific to be part of an outstanding effort, and I learned so much. You know, I started thinking athletes were like Formula One cars, and then I realised that they have minds of their own, moved and were squidgy, you know, not a sort of solid surface, and complex human beings. So that was pretty good experience. I thought, crikey, you know, it's going to be awfully difficult to beat Rio. And we're not going to do it by just doing the same old. So I really had it firmly in my head after Rio that we were going to have to really take a bit of a risk and think laterally on how to, seek any kind of advantage. So when it came to the bike, I'd come to the conclusion that all bikes were really refinements of the Cervelo P3, which I don't know, maybe that's 20 years old. It's some time. But when the P3 came out, it swept the market because it was dramatically the best bike. And since then, everybody's been refining towards the same solution. And the testing that we've done was that all the bikes that cosmetically look differently. They kind of perform about the same. We wanted to try and do something whereby, if nothing else, when the opposition looked at our stuff, they would think, I wish I had one of them. And I know that's a silly objective, but that was some of the thinking. We had a load of brainstorming after Rio, because we had 3 or 4 of us who'd worked on the Rio bike, and we threw ideas into the ring. Some of the ideas were, could we do a little bit more to make the bike and the rider interact more positively? So that was really where we put a lot of focus. How could we get a positive interaction going, but how could we be a little bit different? We put together a whole bunch of experiments which I think if Joe Public saw, they'd go, what on earth has that got to do with the bike? But if you're an academic, you're really into fundamentals, sort of the root cause for things. And that looked good, and we started thinking going wide with the forks and going wide with the seat stays. I actually sketched a artist's impression of how this bike would look, along with a pretty coherent argument that it was worth doing. I showed it to Ian Weatherall, if I remember rightly, in a cafe. And that was, you just get this string of coincidences, but I do believe you make your own luck. And so I teach at Cambridge University. Ian Weatherall's son, Ian owns Hope, his son's at Cambridge. So Ian was coming down to drop him off and things like that. And so we met up and we had a chat, and I said, we want to do a really different bike for Tokyo. And I described it to Ian, and I think that's probably the most expensive cup of coffee he's ever had, because he just said, wow, I think my employees would be really proud to put together something like that for the British team. We're in.
I think what was really interesting from listening to Tony is, obviously you always imagine GB have everything meticulously planned between each Olympic Games, but this came about relatively late in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. He said it was actually early 2019 before everything got going. And it's funny because, as well, with cycling, there's so much tech, particularly in track cycling, that it only gets unlocked from the cupboards once every 4 years. And it's really rare that you see it released this early before the Olympics, with a full 9 months to go. Usually, you keep it locked away, you bring it out just before the games. Like, these are your products that are going to change the games and get you that gold medal.
Or you bring it out in different configurations to throw a little bit of a curveball as well.
Yeah, exactly. They've done this before, where they've brought out something that they know doesn't actually make any improvement, but other nations think, this must be something. So then it kind of, sends on the nations up the garden path. So, you could be forgiven for thinking, why on earth did British Cycling launch this bike with a full 9 months to go? But here's Tony to tell us why.
Well, make no mistake, this wasn't the chosen path. Beginning of 2018, no, it might have been later actually. Anyway, the UCI declared a new set of rules for the Olympics. Basically, you had to race the equipment in 2019, and if you didn't race it, you can't use it. So that was an absolute trauma for the development team, and especially our sponsors, I tell you what, it did wonders for the decision-making process, because you can't mess about. You just have to go, oh, yep, we'll do that. So that's the reason we competed in Glasgow and Minsk, because we had to.
Well, not only did we speak to Tony, we also spoke with Alan Wetherall from Hope Technology, and here's what he had to say about the impact of this new deadline.
It didn't really restrict things too much, I don't think, but it did put a lot of pressure on it, though, because it's quickened everything down, definitely. In a way, it sort of helped, because normally, I know that Chris Clark, who's all the layups, who's done it for Beijing and London Olympics, who works for us. In the past, he's actually been making frames up until the weeks before the event. So at least this deadline by UCI gave everyone a bit of a hurry up to get things done a bit earlier and not leave it to last minute before the event. So it does, inevitably, a designer will always try and improve the design right up to the very last minute. So the more time you give them, the more they'll tweak it. But it doesn't mean that the first one you make isn't correct. So, yeah, it's sometimes good to have a time constraint.
It's funny, as an athlete, a lot of the track riders are getting these bikes very, very late in the day, and they're given very limited time to adjust to them and get used to them. What's your experience like with new bikes? I mean, would you need a little bit of time for it to bed in?
Yeah, I mean, every new bike feels different. I know personally from speaking to the athletes on the Great Britain cycling team that they're pretty happy about this new UCI rule coming in, meaning that they're likely to get the equipment a lot sooner, because I know that in Rio, a lot of the athletes were kind of, as they say, shoved on the bikes a few weeks before, and you've not got much time to adapt to this new bike. Okay, there's going to be a bit of a delay because they have to get all these bikes manufactured, but these riders should get on the bikes and they should have time to adapt to them, with a longer run into Tokyo. Well,
talking about trying out new bikes, let's hear what Tony had to say about when the production of the first bike was actually completed.
We had some great reactions from riders who saw it for the first time. One was a 45-year-old Olympic medalist, and when he saw it for the first time, he was sort of, oh, you gotta be joking, no one's going to want to ride that. And you have to bear in mind that the first models were cobbled together, and it did look a bit of an eyesore. 24 hours later, we had a 23-year-old, and the 23-year-old looked at it and went, wow, all bikes are going to look like that in 5 years' time. And I would really, really be super pleased and proud if that was the case. Quite often when something is, really new and fresh, you get a Marmite reaction. And I have to say, at first I thought, oh, this is pig ugly, and then when it came up, I just think it's gorgeous, and I've got used to it. And look, I'm 61. I'm conservative. So, and then the reaction of the press was, really. Somebody had a look, and it was like 85% positive comments. And people use words like gorgeous, stunning. And actually, I think it looks, pretty sexy. And look, let's face it, cyclists like anything that's sexy.
Well, we've covered a lot about how this project got going, but let's get down to business. Why, Lizzy, is it such a game changer? Well,
it's all about trying to lower the drag coefficient of the rider.
I love it when you start talking about drag coefficients. I pretend I know what you're talking about, but I have no idea.
Well, I'm going to try and simplify it for you. So it's all about trying to lower the drag coefficient of the rider and bike combined. So that's the CDA, the coefficient of drag multiplied by the area. Okay, so from looking at the bike, and I should add, I've not actually seen it in person. I've just kind of scrupulously scoured pictures. But I think it's all to do with the air coming off the front fork and how it interacts with the leg.
I'm going to suggest that your husband has also had some input into this.
Yeah, he has. And then how that same air coming off the leg then interacts with the rear seat stays. So this design seems to create a kind of clearer passage of air and almost reduces the interactions with the air from the front end from 3 to 2. And so by that, I mean, usually you've got the plane of the wheels and the main part of the frame. Then you've got another plane, which is the front forks and the seat stays. Then you've got a third plane, which is the leg. So if you can reduce one of those by combining the forks, seat stays and leg into one plane, then you can reduce the area. So that addresses the A part of CDA. Now, what about the CD? Well, this is all theoretical, as unsurprisingly, Tony did not tell us the secret behind the hopefully impending success of the track bike. But my husband did a little workshop with me on turbulent and laminar airflow and theorised how the bike could be getting these huge advantages that British cycling are talking about. What do you know about airflow then, Tom?
Before we started recording, you told me about golf balls and why they fly so well through the air, and that is about the extent of my knowledge of aerodynamics.
Absolutely. So, if you were to design 2 golf balls, the same weight and size, but the only difference is that one had dimples and one was smooth, then throw them with exactly the same force as each other, then the dimpled one is going to go a hell of a lot further than the other one.
Lizzy, why?
Why? Okay. Well, it's all to do with airflow, which can either be laminar, which is smooth, or turbulent, which is not smooth. The dimples on the golf ball cause the air around the ball to be more turbulent. So this turbulent air actually causes the ball to travel faster through the air. Although, to be honest, this is really getting into reasons that are far beyond my knowledge and understanding. So let's get back to the bikes.
Well, actually, there is something else I know about drag when it comes to bikes, and it's the rider that causes most of the drag. Basically, it's the rider that's the problem. If bikes could just ride themselves, they'd all go a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. The drag of the rider is much larger than the drag of the bike.
This bike, then, does that reduce the drag of the rider?
Well, there's not much you can really do to reduce the drag of a rider other than donning a fancy skin suit and helmet and changing their position on the bike. You can't exactly take a hacksaw to their legs and, shape them a bit differently. But what you could do, if you're smart enough, is develop a bike that influences the drag caused by the rider and therefore lowering the overall drag of bike and rider combined.
Okay, but this is all theoretical, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This was the result of a brainstorming session between my husband and I, who's looking at things through the eyes of an
Tell you what, the nights at your house must just fly by. We just watch telly and fall asleep.
Yeah, well, he's an aerodynamicist and I'm coming at it from a professional cycling background, so we're not a bad team.
So how do you, and by you, I mean, how do you and Gabriel think it actually works then?
Well, have you seen those trip strips that triathletes sometimes stick to their legs in the vain hope of making themselves go faster?
Yeah, I have, and I've also heard about people not shaving the back of their legs as well.
Yeah, that's something they do, although actually you're more likely to get it wrong than get it right, so I wouldn't bother doing that. Well, anyway, trip strips are illegal in UCI races, but the science of it is that it creates a more turbulent airflow around the leg, which in turn reduces the wake of air behind the leg, like a golf ball and its dimples, therefore making you go faster.
So, is there something happening with the front fork then that's trying to reduce the drag of the leg, or the wake of the leg?
Yeah, now we're talking. So the drag on a leg is huge. If, theoretically, the front fork actually causes the air that hits the leg and travels around it to be more turbulent, then the leg is going to travel through the air more like a dimpled golf ball than a smooth one.
Right, I definitely want my legs to travel like a dimpled golf ball. So it's like a legal trip strip, basically.
Yeah, well, that's the theory. Of course, we could be barking up completely the wrong tree, but that's the theory that Gabriel and I came up with.
Well, it's funny, us doing this is probably what every other cycling federation around the world are doing. They're looking at that bike and wondering, how does it work? And they can only work off pictures, like us.
Yeah, I know, and they can pay us for all of this later. I'll send you my address at the end of the podcast.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, cycling podcast team car at the back of the pack, please. That's Seb Piquet, the voice of Radio Tour at the Tour de France, to remind us to tell you that this episode is supported by Alzheimer's Society.
850,000 people in the UK are living with dementia, and that number is predicted to rise to 1 million by 2025. Alzheimer's Society works to help people who are living with the disease by giving them and their families support while also working to find a cure.
Well, it's the start of a new year, Richard. It's a time when we all look ahead and set ourselves challenges for the months ahead. Alzheimer's Society has a series of charity cycling events for riders of all abilities that people can take part in 2020.
They do indeed. For beginners, there's a London to Brighton ride on September the 13th, with 4,000 riders taking on the 54-mile challenge, a challenge that we're familiar with, Lionel, having done a similar event last year. It finishes on Brighton seafront. There are 3 night rider events in June and July in London, Liverpool and Bristol, which take you through the city at night.
Yeah, well, fond memories of the London to Brighton. Intermediate level riders might want to take on Ride London on August the 16th. This is pretty much as big as it gets in the UK. 30,000 riders tackling a 100-mile course on closed roads, finishing in front of Buckingham Palace. Or there's Velo Birmingham on June the 21st, also 100 miles long and on closed roads in the West Midlands.
And for the experienced riders, there's a multi-day challenge, the 4-day London to Paris ride in July, or the 9-day Deloitte ride across Britain, one of the toughest events around. I know a few people who've done that, actually. It takes you from Land's End to John O'Groats.
So if you're looking for a brilliant cycling challenge this year, check out alzheimers.org.uk/cycle and help Alzheimer's Society to get closer to a cure for dementia.
That's alzheimers.org.uk/cycle.
Well, that's enough mind-boggling tech for now. What about the competition? The same day I interviewed Tony, Pinarello put out a press release for their brand new track bike that the Italian team is hoping to be their own game changer heading into 2020. Looking at the photos, I noticed a trend towards wider forks, but with a kind of pretty traditional design in the rest of the frame. I asked Tony what he thought of the new design and if there was anything radical there.
No, not really. I think it's pretty plain vanilla. Very good looking, very Italian, Gucci. I'd be surprised if it's actually any faster than the Bolide sort of track bike that they have had in the past.
Well, I guess that was pretty clear from Tony then. Good looking, but boring.
I've got to say, against a black backdrop as the photos, it does look amazing.
Yeah, as he said, Gucci, sexy, but I don't know, maybe not got the aerodynamic advantage that the GB one has. But my teammate on my trade team, Bigla Katusha, Martina Alzini, she's actually going to be riding this Pinarello, hopefully in the games. She's one of a team of 4 youngsters from Italy who are really on the up in team pursuit. They were the under-23 European champions this year. They got a bronze medal at the Minsk Track World Cup. So they're really coming up and they're snapping at the heels of GB. First off, I asked Martina about the new Pinarello that had just been released.
Yeah, okay, to be honest, I've never tried it because now we have just 2 frames, I think. Yeah, it's just 2 frames because it's really new and also the guys have just 2. Asking to the other girls, I have asked the other girls what they think about it, if it's true that it's so innovative or it's just, the new way or just because the brand have to show it, but no, they are 100% sure that this is one of the best bikes that they have tried on the track, especially the reaction that this frame have during a sprint, during I don't know, for example, if they try to do a sprint or a fly lap or something like this on the training, they completely feel the difference. Maybe it's reactive, the first words for this frame, but also aerodynamics, because now we know that aerodynamics is one of the most important things on the track, and they want to be something that have the right compromise.
Lizzy, did you ask her what she thought of the competition's bike?
Yes, I did, and here's what she had to say about the opposition.
The first time, I think that everyone the first time saw it on Instagram, in the picture, And we were in a training camp, I think, before the Europeans or somewhere. And we say, oh my God, is that allowed for racing? And lots of girls, the first question was like, it seemed really dangerous. Maybe, it happens a crash with this kind of bar behind, maybe too exposed, especially on the high level, like the one behind the saddle. But we say, okay, if they build it and if they show it, it's because it's allowed, and it's because someone has studied that the best structure for this bike is like this. And we are really, curious to see this work, especially for the pursuit.
So I think one of the reasons why track cycling has been a bit more on my radar recently than it has in the past. Obviously, we're in a run-up to an Olympic Games, but also because of teams like HB.T and the sort of innovative approach they've had, and we want to speak to them for a future episode, because they're about to make an assault on all kinds of world records, hopefully around April time. You actually spoke to Tony about HB.T, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. So, HB have gained such huge popularity in the UK, and, they hail from the wonderful city of Barbados. And
as someone from Nottingham, I'm not supposed to say that. Do you know that? There's a bit of a rivalry there.
Oh, I did not know that. Well, as someone from Sheffield, I'm probably not supposed to say that either. But anyway, so I'm a big fan of what the HB.T team are doing. I think they've been really great for track cycling. But I asked Tony if he thought the Great Britain cycling team had anything to learn from the likes of HB.T.
I often get asked this, and it's a difficult one, because everything that HB have done, are doing, is what we used to do, but we kept it deadly secret. So at first I didn't really like their activities, because I was thinking, oh my goodness, they're selling the world on all the stuff that is bread and butter to us, but we don't want to talk about it. But actually they've been fantastic for the world of track cycling, and they've been, I think, motivational within the British team, because they've done some things that we have put some work into, but people get very conservative when they do well. And to have these youngsters from Derby just go, what the hell, and do different stuff, I think was a great sort of motivator within the team. So, schizophrenic view, I'd rather they'd not existed, because then they wouldn't have sold engineering to the world, but I greatly admire them for doing so, and I think that net they've been a great thing for cycling.
Well, it sounds like Team GB feel really pushed by, annoyed at first, but a bit pushed by what teams like HB.T are doing, but also the other federations. It's a funny old game, isn't it? Track cycling. There's periods where GB seem to be light years ahead of everyone else, and then there's periods where the other teams catch up until there's another sort of paradigm shift, I guess, in the bike design and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear how a trade team that started really, really small, they've really started to push GB to their limits, both physically and in terms of technology. And it's really great to see, we all push each other. And I think sometimes national teams can become complacent, because you kind of live in your own little world. So I think it's great. I think the more competition, the better. And I think what's going to be really interesting and potentially really sad is that this could all change next year when the UCI ban on trade teams comes in. But I think that's another topic for another episode.
David, well, before we go, obviously, I'm going to put these in a sealed envelope, so we are heading towards the Olympic Games. I thought it might end this with a bit of a prediction. So I'll take the women's team pursuit. So what's the current record? Do you know it off the top of your head?
I thought it was 4:12.2, but I just looked it up and it was 4:10.2. And so
they just took 2 seconds off it. Amazing.
So that was set by the British quartet in Rio.
Okay, so what I want to do is your prediction for the time that they will do in Tokyo.
I reckon it's going to be hot, so I reckon they will do 49.8.
Okay, we'll seal that immediately and we'll unseal it after the Olympic Games. Lizzy, thank you very much. You've done a lot of hard work this month and a lot of science.
I have to say, I didn't do the work. Gabriel did the work and I just listened and wrote it all down.
Well, even then, you did a very good job. Thanks, Lizzy. I'll see you next month.
Thanks, Tom.
This episode of Service Course was produced by me. Our theme music is Beyond the Black Veil by the brilliant Moscow Youth Cult. Do go and check them out. Additional music also comes from Moscow Youth Cult's John Dix. Thanks as ever, John. And the rest of the tracks in the show come via Epidemic Sound. For details of the individual tracks, then please check the show notes. Thanks again.